Hi, my name's Andrew McLaren. Today we're going to talk about how you can plan out a science unit so that's NGSS aligned or even the whole school year so that you have a sequence covering all of your different performance expectations. So this is kind of what I've done in the past when I had no curriculum and there was just some outdated resources that were like pre-NGSS that they had. And this was before OpenSciEd really came out, which is really good for middle school. They're working on high school. I believe it's gonna release soon. Elementary school's gonna be a little ways out. But that's an alternative to using this because that is open source. But for this video, what we're going to be covering today is we're going to be talking about these 5 steps of brainstorming the standards and then considering the timing of all of these performance expectations, doing some research, putting it all together into an actual unit, and then doing some post-unit evaluation. So I'll go in depth into those steps and we'll get started on that now. So the first step in this process is to sort your performance expectations into units. So for example, at 7th grade, I did plate tectonics, energy, reactions, and then ecology. So this was the integrated approach, which a lot of states have started to move towards. Otherwise, if you're doing all life science, this would be stuff like evolution and ecology and that kind of stuff, like maybe a little bit of body systems and cells. So you'd have those units and you know where like the major areas that you're going to be focusing on at a certain time. There are other ways to arrange these. Like I've seen some people saying like maybe we could have a practice-based unit so it's all on asking questions. That's not how I chose to do it. It didn't really make sense to me. I wanted to keep it still within a content like specific thing for a couple weeks together so we could tie together those concepts. So you need to read each of these performance expectations and just brainstorm. That's the most important part of this whole process is just having you start and be like, when I read this, what do I think of? You could do this on paper or slides to have this be a little bit more free form, but I would recommend doing this on Google Docs. That's just always how I've done this. And I was considering things like local phenomenon, like where am I living? Are there volcanoes nearby? Are there certain biomes that have been studied that we can reference? Are there any engaging activities or labs or simulations that I'm thinking of? Any personal favorites that you may have? So, for example, I love to garden. I also love to hike. And so there's certain things that I'm passionate about. And if I can bring that into the classroom, then students will oftentimes receive that a little bit better when the teacher's excited to be covering certain things, right? So you want to pick things that you want to teach to some degree that matches these performance expectations. Like, don't do something that you're not supposed to and waste that time because you've got very limited time. But if it lines up with what you're supposed to be doing, that's fantastic. And then are there any school traditions like field trips that they've done or outdoor school, and how can you incorporate some of what you need to cover into those perhaps state mandated expectations or like various things that you need to fit into, right? So if we're thinking about this, I want to show you what this might look like. So here I have an attempted at just like throwing ideas down on this where I would see certain evidence statements and just jot down ideas and maybe put a couple links in there. So this was interesting to go through that process. Google Drive is kind of limiting because it makes you write in a certain format, whereas you can on paper you can do a lot more free form things. But this was a really interesting thing for me to just kind of be like, what do I think when I see this standard? What do I think of doing? And I did this for a couple different units during the COVID pandemic because I had some time to actually look at this before diving into trying to teach it. And then I tried to get like some activities that made sense or went with these different parts of the performance expectations that were like within, for example, the chemistry or the ecology section of that school year. So this is a really good thing to get started with. And then I had something where I could then build out specific lessons and link to those various things. These are from different years. I'll go over this a little bit more in depth soon, but this is like a first attempt brainstorm. Like let's start here and then go there because we had just done waves due to doing forces and motion and all that stuff, doing a little bit of energy at 8th grade, I think this was. And so then it was like, okay, let's go into like planets and scale and then link that to a couple other performance expectations. So there's like a cross-cutting concept there. Um, just general brainstorming. And I'll go over this more in depth soon, but then I was able to build a various list of resources in an actual sequence that made sense to me. And this is also an example of a final draft, but this is also kind of like a rough draft that was made into something that was more formal. But it had like a couple different lessons related to that performance expectation, which is the main idea. So a very important thing to consider when you're planning out a unit or the whole school year is how much time are you going to cover for a particular concept or performance expectation. And if you look at sixth grade, there's about 16 to 18 performance expectations, depending on how the states decide to split the middle school bands. It might be a little bit different. And if you're assuming about 40 weeks of instruction, that gives you 2 to 3 weeks per performance expectation. I personally like to aim for doing 2 weeks per, and that will give you a couple extra weeks, which if you've taught for a couple of years, you know that you're going to lose a couple weeks anyways to just, oh, we're doing like a project fair, or we're doing fire drills, or we're doing a little field trip for something. And so you're going to lose at least 2 to 3 weeks. So just keep that in mind, that you're going to lose a fair amount of instructional time to other things that need to happen for the school. So just plan to go under a little bit. And if you do that, you can cover all of your performance expectations for a school year. I've done this a couple times now, and people have a hard time believing this, but it comes down to holding yourself to 2 weeks per each of these things. You can't go longer. And if you do, then you're going to be sacrificing some other content that could be covered. So if you plan knowing that, then you're not going to over plan, and you're going to be able to hold yourself to that number a little more consistently. And then what I ended up doing with one of the years was I focused on the cross-kind concepts and had students do like a kind of a scavenger hunt with previous assignments to kind of point out, where is scale in our year that we just did? Where is arguing from evidence? And so they had to go back and try and evaluate some of that stuff, which was kind of cool. So if you have a little bit of extra time, you can end the NGSS with a slightly different focus than just doing all these performance expectations. You can do a big project. There's a number of different things that you could do with like technology, or like the education version of Minecraft. You can do a ton of things in that, or coding. There's a lot of options for you if you have extra time. But what you want to make sure is make sure you cover everything first that you should be, so that the next teacher in the next grade level can cover their stuff that they need to do, right? So another important component of this is researching what's online. When you Google a performance expectation like MSLS 1-1, then you should be able to find some resources, but you got to be careful because they're not always actually aligned. Most of the time, they're not actually aligned. When people say something's aligned, I don't really believe them by default at this point. So just be aware of that. I'm going to go over evidence statements a little bit in this video, as well as how to find some free resources that are aligned to the NGSS, but I have separate videos on that already on my YouTube channel that are fairly long, so I don't want to be redundant and do all of that in this video too. I did want to also point out that OpenSciEd does have free and aligned units and lessons, so you can see that, but it takes a little while to get used to their format and their forms of assessing and supporting asking questions. And there's like almost too many resources when you open up a lesson, so it can be hard to navigate. So just be aware of that, that if you're just trying to do something quick and like just cover what you're trying to do, OpenSciEd may be a little bit intimidating, but it is very high quality, and it actually is aligned from what I've seen compared to like 7 sold curriculums, and it's completely free due to it being an open source project that has some grant funding. So if you are looking at an NGSS standard like MSLS 1-1, you can go to these evidence statements, which are linked on the page there, which tells you a little bit more specifically what they actually are intending students to be able to do, these observable things that you can score. Can the student do this or not? They're all right here. And then you can look at what you've found online and be like, is this actually being done? And what components are actually being done here? Have I actually gotten them to do all of these, or have I done 5 activities that only focus on these parts? So just keep that in mind. That's a pretty useful thing. The NSTA has some good resources with this as well. So once you have your brainstorm and other people's ideas and you've really looked at this stuff closely, then you can start putting the connected pieces together so you can figure out which performance expectations make sense to do earlier and then what other ones you want to do later and the connections between them. So you can figure out what you're going to talk to students about and how those lessons will help students see those connections. So you want to keep track of this ideally per performance expectation and you can have folders for each week or a folder for each performance expectation. There's a number of ways to break these down, and then put all of those lessons in your Google Drive or folder or however you want to organize this. This could be folders on a computer as well. But for me, I like to hyperlink everything and have it on the cloud. So I typically default to that when I'm thinking of this stuff. So then you can have an assessment, but your assessment needs to measure each of these performance expectations. So you can either do an assessment at the end of every 2 weeks, or you can do a bigger assessment. So it's like an ecology assessment, but in that you're going to need to identify what part of the test is for what performance expectation. And then that allows you to score those things a little bit more clearly, which is a big philosophy in standards-based grading or mastery grading. So if you're trying to have an assessment at the end of a unit of all these different performance expectations, you want to make sure those various skills that were present there are actually being assessed so students can improve on that. So that's the general idea. And here is kind of what it looks like. This is one of my early attempts at this. So you can see I've got like my performance expectation and different lessons that are related to them. And then I have some bigger project. This is, as you can see, related to this modeling out the function of a cell. And so they're building a little model analogy project so you can kind of see how that makes sense. But then there was also a test that we wanted to do. So there was some just like, okay, well, that project wasn't really an assessment. It wasn't individually assessed. So we wanted to work on stuff that was more aligned to the different pieces that we could measure for students. But it was a little bit content focused. As I said, this is one of my earlier attempts. But you can have these ideas that are connected, and in a similar fashion, this is where I've got my various lessons for the performance expectations. Here, it's a little bit less clear which lessons go with what performance expectation. So it was a little bit harder to know, did I actually cover all these various things just by looking at this document? But that's the general idea. And then you've got something where you can say, okay, I've got about 2 weeks to cover this. I've got about 2 weeks to cover that. Or like 5 instructional days if you're doing 45-minute periods each day, or something equivalent to that with blocks, right? So that's the general take on how you get logical flow, and you want to make sure that it makes sense. As you can see in this one, they need to know what a cell is for us to be able to then talk about the components and modeling out these different cell parts. They need to have a foundation of like the concept of a cell, big picture, right? And then they can get the organelles and those parts. And then they need to understand that and those concepts of cells and whatnot so that they can then do the body systems, which would next be the next part of that life science component that for me was at 6th grade. So there is a sequence that kind of makes sense in there. And for like my chemistry thing, there was a similar approach where I was trying to figure out like, well, what do they need first, and then what are they going to get later in these concepts? So you can see I'm starting off with general terms that may be more familiar with them, like mixtures, and then helping them understand the idea of like a reaction and what a reaction really is, or a chemical change, what that really is. And then we're modeling out some of this stuff with some actual models and like Google Slides illustrations that I'm making of reactions happening, showing like molecules rearranging the atoms into different molecules. So then you understand what an atom and a molecule is, and then you can go into some of the stuff being applied a little bit more. So there's a sequence that kind of makes sense, and you can think about like, oh, how is this matching that part, and get that planned out. This was something that I also played around with making. You can kind of see that I have the evidence statements and different days so I can know where that evidence statement is closest aligned. So I was pulling these performance expectations and trying to see where is that and helping me keep track of like what am I covering, what am I not covering, just to make my thinking clear for myself and other people as well in terms of trying to figure out how all the stuff works together. So some things are best done at the end, and you don't really know how students are going to perform on the test until you've actually taught the lessons and done the test. And so when you're done with that, you may realize, hey, students really struggled with this part. I want to fix that for next year. And I would encourage you to have that mentality where it's like, I'm not going to fix it this year. I'm going to fix it next year. Because if we are constantly trying to fix things that we didn't cover quite so well with this topic, there's other topics that won't get covered. So keeping that in mind, try and keep track of what lessons worked well for you, ones that need to be replaced. And so you could do color coding, like you could mark certain ones in green that you want to keep, yellow for like, oh, this is okay, and red for like, do not do this ever again. So there's a number of ways that you could mark which lessons were like your favorites and which ones were not. But make sure this isn't just something that you like. Make sure it's something that actually lines up with that assessment, which should be lining up with that performance expectation. So you may want to, at the end, do a little audit of your assessments as well and be like, is this really getting at my various pieces of my evidence statement, or is there some components they're missing? And how could I add those in to help understand their ability to do that better? So there's a ton of different ways to look at this, but this is an important part of planning out a year. The planning shouldn't be done when you start teaching, or even when you're done with that unit. There should be some planning out of that stuff and reflecting on that so that next year you can have an even better, stronger unit. All right. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for McLearning with me. Before you go, please check out the following services that I offer with my business. So if you click the link in my videos, this goes to my website. I might be changing it from Podia because I'm no longer doing the interactive videos for sale. I might put those up for free. But most of my other services are linked here. So you can see that I've got like a Teachers Pay Teachers and a Wyzant. The Teachers Pay Teachers has a lot of my assessments that I have for like the NGSS, as well as lessons that I made when I was actually a teacher in the classroom. So I've got quite a few things like CERs and other things on there. If you want to get one-on-one live support from me, either like with science or like working on like teaching support lessons and that kind of stuff, you can sign up through Wyzant. I have a link to there where you can contact me there, and we can schedule hourly appointments. And I've got a few other things on here like a Facebook page, and other social media. And if you're interested in getting professional development with me for like a team of teachers, a whole page with information on that. So yeah, feel free to check that out. Thank you.